Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of the Pascagoula Alien Encounter? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Charles Hickson was born in 1931 and lived in the state of Mississippi. He eventually moved to the town of Pascagoula and raised a family. In 1973, a man named Calvin Parker was living with the Hickson family. He had been born in 1954. Charles was able to get Calvin a job at the same place where he worked, the F.B. Walker & Sons Shipyard. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On Thursday, October 11, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker contacted the Keesler Air Force Base and said they wanted to report an encounter with aliens. They were directed to contact local law enforcement, which they did sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Here is the story the men supplied to the police. After finishing work at the shipyard that day, the men decided to go fishing on the west bank of the Pascagoula River. They were positioned on an old pier between the Highway 90 bridge and a railroad. No trespassing signs were posted there, but the men disregarded them. Just as it was getting dark, the men heard a zipping sound and saw a large football-shaped object with blue flashing lights about 70 feet away. It was 30 feet long, had a dome on top, and was floating about 2 feet above the ground. The object, which was kind of like a flying saucer, came to a stop not far from the men. One end of the object opened, and 3 creatures exited. The aliens were described as robot-like humanoids with gray skin, claws for hands, a hole for a mouth, and carrot-like protrusions where the nose and ears would be. Each entity did not have a neck and did not appear to have eyes. They were just over 5 feet tall. Similar to the spacecraft, they never actually touched the ground. All 3 creatures floated over to the men. 2 of them grabbed Charles with their crab-like claws, and the other one grabbed Calvin. Charles remained awake but paralyzed during this whole encounter. Calvin, on the other hand, passed out in the beginning of the incident and did not wake up until it was over. The only thing Calvin remembered was being grabbed by an alien as it made a humming noise. It was probably trying to think of a song, but could not remember the words. Charles remembered being taken aboard the spacecraft, which was extremely well lighted. While on board, he was scanned by an 8-inch mechanical eye and believed he had been given a thorough medical examination. After about 30 minutes, the aliens brought Charles back to the pier, where he saw Calvin looking up in the air with his hands outstretched. At this point, the spacecraft quickly flew away from the area. The men returned to their vehicle, where Charles consumed whiskey. Initially, they didn't want to say anything, but after a short while, the men decided to tell the authorities about their unbelievable encounter with extraterrestrials. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. Both Charles and Calvin seemed genuinely upset. They were described as hysterical, crying, and climbing the walls. After each man separately supplied his story to the police, they were put in a room together and secretly recorded. Officers were hoping that the men would say something to indicate they were involved in a hoax, but they never did. Instead, they talked about how terrible and frightening the alien encounter was. As far as physical evidence, the officers noticed that both men had a puncture wound. Eventually, the police administered a so-called lie detector test to each of the men. This test, which is also referred to as a polygraph, is nothing but pseudoscientific nonsense. Using a polygraph to test the veracity of an alien encounter story is like believing that a photograph of Santa Claus is authentic because it was taken by the Easter Bunny. The police came to believe that the men were telling the truth based on the idea that they passed the lie detector test, even though a person cannot pass or fail a polygraph. The story about the alien encounter was big news locally and nationally. Charles and Calvin adopted different approaches as far as how they interacted with the media. Charles appeared on television shows like Johnny Carson, Dick Cavett, and To Tell the Truth. He also gave numerous interviews and lectures. Calvin, on the other hand, was reluctant to tell his story and mostly stayed away from the media for many years. Considering his claim about passing out, he really didn't have much of a story to tell. In 1974, Charles claimed that the aliens returned and visited him on 3 occasions. During one encounter, he was sitting under a tree eating an orange when 2 aliens appeared. They communicated with him telepathically and expressed how they did not mean him any harm and they would return someday. Charles also wrote a book about the Pascagoula River alien encounter, which he self-published in 1983. Despite initially being uninterested in fame, Calvin eventually sought out the media. He changed his story and said that he was being deceptive about his claim that he passed out. Now Calvin was saying that he never passed out and he remembered everything that the aliens did to him. In his new narrative, when he was taken aboard the spacecraft, he was examined by a petite female alien who possessed an intense interest in his genitals. He found this alien to be attractive and would have been interested in dating her. Like Charles, Calvin also said the aliens visited him again after the incident in 1973. He said that in 1992, he encountered the same spacecraft. This time, instead of being escorted onto the ship by floating aliens, he walked aboard of his own volition. He met with the same female alien who had been fascinated by his genitals 19 years earlier. Calvin and the alien spoke in English, and she gave him an important message. She wanted him to know that the Bible was authentic, and she worshipped the same God as him. Her species wanted to relocate to Earth, but they had concerns because human beings were too aggressive and harmful. Re-energized by his new story, Calvin attended many UFO conventions and, in 1993, started his own company called UFO Investigations. The company was supposed to produce television shows about alien encounters. On September 9, 2011, 80-year-old Charles Hickson died from a heart attack. Throughout his life, he never generated significant income from being an alien encounter survivor. With his colleague gone, Calvin Parker continued his quest to achieve fame and fortune. In 2018, he published his own book about the Pascagoula River alien encounter. Just like Charles, Calvin never achieved any meaningful level of success. On August 24, 2023, Calvin Parker died from kidney cancer at the age of 68. The Pascagoula alien encounter has become a legendary event in the world of those who believe in extraterrestrial visitors. Right after the encounter, the police received thousands of phone calls. Many members of the local community were paranoid and fearful. Some were even using aluminum foil to make hats and to cover their windows in an effort to protect their brains from the aliens. Based on this behavior, one could argue that the aliens would have had trouble detecting their brains with or without the foil. In 2019, an organization erected a historical marker at the site of the alleged abduction with the approval of the city. Among other things, it stands as a testament to the power of imagination and alcohol. Now moving to my analysis. Supposedly, the Pascagoula alien encounter is one of the most credible stories of extraterrestrial visitors. Many people believe the account offered by Charles and Calvin. Others are more skeptical, claiming that the men were being deceptive. This brings me to the question, were the men being honest? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that the men were telling the truth, starting with the factors that support this theory. Many years after the alleged encounter, several witnesses came forward and said they saw strange lights in the sky on the night of October 11, 1973. A few of them described the object as bright and hovering close to the ground. Charles and Calvin sustained what appeared to be puncture wounds, which is consistent with their story. Both men had a change in mood after the alleged encounter. Charles was melancholy and depressed for many years, and Calvin was admitted to a mental health treatment facility for some type of breakdown. As I mentioned, officers secretly recorded the men when they were put together in a room in the police station. Calvin indicated he came close to dying and mentioned how this was the first time he passed out in his life. He also described the door of the spacecraft. Charles told Calvin that the experience scared him to death and remarked how they would not get over this in a lifetime. He also expressed concern that the aliens could have harmed them. The men never mentioned anything about fabricating the story. Now moving to the factors contradicting the theory that the men were telling the truth. The bridge that the men were fishing near was a drawbridge which always had 2 tenders on duty. Neither bridge tender saw anything out of the ordinary. The mental health breakdown that Calvin had could be interpreted as supporting his claim that he experienced a stressful event, but there is another way to look at this. Maybe Calvin was experiencing psychosis. Over time, Charles changed his story somewhat. For example, he had initially described the creature's mouth as being a hole, but later said it was like a slit. Charles suffered from credibility challenges outside of his alien story. For example, he had once been fired from a job for improperly obtaining money from employees under his supervision. Calvin also had credibility issues. He admitted that he lied about passing out. The day of the alleged encounter was Calvin's first day at work at the shipyard. Maybe he went along with the story that Charles offered because he didn't want to risk his job. Charles said that the aliens performed a thorough medical examination just like a physician would have, yet they never asked for a copay. This is impossible to believe. When considering all the evidence, do I think that the men were telling the truth? No. In my opinion, the men were clearly lying. They were never visited by a groin-gazing extraterrestrial or any other type of intergalactic crotch inspector. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Charles experienced a phenomenon called awareness during sleep paralysis, which is also referred to as ASP. This occurs when a person becomes aware that their muscles are paralyzed during REM sleep. It can be quite frightening and lead to anxiety, dread, visual and auditory hallucinations, and a feeling of floating or spinning. People who are creative, distrustful, or have schizoid personality features are at a higher risk to attribute this experience to an alien encounter. This is referred to as a monothematic delusion, that is, a fixed false belief that comes about after a person has an uncommon experience. Given the nature of the hallucinations associated with ASP, like lights, strange figures, demons, and buzzing noises, it is not surprising that people would think of aliens. Charles was trespassing on the pier and worried about the police showing up, which could explain why flashing blue lights were on his mind. As far as Calvin, some people believe that he developed shared psychotic disorder, like the delusions that Charles had transmitted to him. I think it's more likely that Calvin was simply gullible. He went along with the story because it never occurred to him that Charles could be lying. Calvin may have passed out from alcohol consumption, but found the explanation that Charles had to be more compelling. Now moving to my final thoughts. The reason that some people found the Pascagoula River alien encounter to be convincing was the apparent dedication of the men to their story. The men truly believed, at least in the beginning, that they had encountered health screening aliens. People were left to decide what story was more difficult to believe, that aliens would visit the planet Earth, or that any species would offer free health care. Those are my thoughts on the Pascagoula River alien encounter. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.